You know those times where doing anything in your journal just feels like a complete struggle? You've set up all these layouts with very good intentions of getting in and filling them in, but in the day-to-day it just feels like way too much of a mission, the journal gets left by the wayside, your trackers are empty, and then you come to the end of the week or month or whatever, and you look at your planner like, well, heck. Sometimes, honestly, I just can't be bothered with my journal, and I think that's okay. And it's in these periods in particular where I need low energy planning. The easiest way to think about low energy planning is to first consider the symptoms that show that it might be necessary. So sometimes when we're doing our journal, we're feeling really motivated. We really want to get in and do those kind of creative or ambitious layouts. We want to try styles of doodles or decoration that we haven't done before. The ones that we've been saving on Instagram or Pinterest as try this at some point, and now seems like the time to do it. Getting in and filling in our trackers feels like a breeze. We're writing things down. We're feeling very accomplished, checking a bunch of things off. And keeping up with our journal in general is going really well. Heck, maybe even keeping up with multiple journals is going really well. Now, if this does not sound like you on a typical day, don't worry, because often this period of high energy or high motivation for our journals is short-lived. We're not gonna feel like that all the time towards our journals. That's just life. In the other periods where we're not feeling that really high energy, high motivation towards our planning, what we're probably in is a more mid to lower energy space. And it's in these times where low energy planning can be really beneficial. The kind of symptoms we're thinking about here are feeling a little less inclined to get into your journal. Setting up trackers and then filling them in on a day-to-day basis just feels like it's a bit too much. Because we're not getting into our journals as often, we're not writing things down, and this usually comes at the periods where we would most benefit from writing things down. Usually it's in periods of higher stress, where we have a lot to do and a lot on our plate, where using our journal would be the most beneficial, but we're not doing it because it just feels overwhelming. It's good to note here that the high motivation or low motivation periods aren't really binary. It's more of a spectrum. There's also not necessarily a specific time scale where we might fall into either of those, or anywhere in between. Often we can turn from high motivation to quite low motivation very quickly, and this can make things difficult when we're thinking about the us that set up our journal versus the us that has to fill it in. If high energy you sets up your journal with, a whole bunch of trackers and things are decorative and things are a little bit more complicated, but then low energy you is the one that has to fill them in on the day-to-day, that can be a bit of a challenge. It's also good to note that if, like me, you use multiple journals, you're not necessarily going to fall at the same point on the spectrum for every single journal. For instance, if we take maybe a reading journal and an everyday journal, you might be quite low motivation for your everyday journal, but high motivation for your reading journal. In those periods where we're feeling lower motivation though, or feeling a little less inclined to use our journals and planners, that's when low energy planning can be really helpful. The main purpose for low energy planning or low energy planning strategies is to get us using our journals and planners when our motivation is lower. This is going to look a little bit different for all of us, but one of the biggest things we're trying to do is make our planning easier. For me, this is things like when setting up my trackers, considering how I'm going to fill them in. I realistically only want to be using minimal supplies when I do this. So can I fill this in with just one, maybe 2 pens maximum? If I have to fill in a tracker with 6 different pens and do a very detailed pattern that takes me way too long to do, I'm not going to be inclined to do it when my motivation is low. This can also be considering how often I have to check in with my journal. If I have a tracker that's telling me I need to check in 5 different times a day at very specific times, the burden for that is going to be a lot higher compared to something that I can just check in with at the end of the day. If I do want to use a tracker that has data that is collecting at specific times, is there a way I can capture that data and then add it to my journal later? Maybe I could put it in the Notes app on my phone or send a message to myself via Messenger. If I can kind of batch doing that data entry at one point in the day, rather than having to jump in and do it multiple times in the day, it'll just make it a little bit easier. Another way that I can make my journaling easier is just by setting up less stuff to fill in. When my motivation is lower, I already don't really want to use my journal, so if I can set up less things, it means that the time I have to spend in there is lower. I know that sounds very negative, I don't really mean it to, but if you're feeling low motivation to do something, then do less of it. Some is better than none. In those times where my motivation to use my journal is lower, I'm just going to set up less collections that I then have to fill in after the fact. If we're thinking about a monthly setup, this might be limiting it to my actions list, cover page, monthly log, and a habit tracker, rather than also adding on a work outputs layout and a reflections page and a time tracker. When we have less to set up and less to fill in, the entire process seems less burdensome. Another thing that I do to make my journaling easier, and then easier to keep up with when I'm lower motivation, is making the decorative style easier. Rather than trying to do complicated doodles or decoration, I'll opt for things like washi tape, stickers, colored paper. All of those things are going to be easier to just stick into my journal rather than trying to draw something that might be a little bit harder to do. I always find I'm way more inclined to use my journals and planners if I like the way they look. And if I can do that decorative stuff with less effort, then that's a win. While the first low energy planning strategy is very much making things easier, the second one is about looking ahead, or planning in advance for periods where I'm going to likely feel lower motivation. My motivation is typically highest when I'm setting up a new monthly setup, or nowadays a new cyclic setup. I get excited about setting up those initial pages, changing the theme up, that kind of stuff, but I need to make sure that I don't let that version of myself that has higher motivation dictate what low motivation, low energy Jess is going to be doing in the future. When we're higher energy, we're more likely to take on things that are more challenging, more time and labor intensive. This can mean setting up more than future us can handle, setting up more layouts to fill in, doing decorative styles that we then want to maintain throughout the rest of the month. When I'm doing these setups, I try to be very mindful of my future self, making sure that future me doesn't have as much of a struggle or much of an effort to fill this stuff in. That means putting in decorative elements ahead of time, making sure that the way I'm filling in my layouts isn't going to be too much of a struggle. Are they going to be filled in with lots of different pens or just the one? Is it just putting in a dot or a check mark, or am I going to have to draw out some kind of pattern or doodle? The harder those things are, or the harder they seem, the less likely future me is actually going to keep up with it. As part of this planning ahead process, I also like to consider, what do I actually have on my calendar? If I know that in the period that I'm setting up for, I have a bunch of different events, which are going to have a bunch of different tasks associated with them, I don't want to pile on by making my journal setup really complicated and hard to fill in. Future you already has enough on their plate, we don't want to add more to that plate. One of the ways that we can start to kind of appreciate these times of lower motivation, or possibly predict when they're going to happen, is paying attention to what's going on anytime we feel lower motivation. Do you find that you're feeling lower motivation in your planner at the end of the month in particular? Or is it a particular time of week that you start to drop off in your motivation? Maybe it picks up at the start of the next week. Paying attention to those things means we can then account for them. This is kind of a reflective and iterative process. For example, I know that come mid-month, that's usually when my motivation to get in and use my journal starts to drop off. That's why I have so many trackers which are half filled. This is something that I've come to appreciate about myself. As soon as I set up for the next month, or nowadays the next cycle, my motivation to use the current month or current cycle, off a cliff. Keeping that in mind, now rather than setting up for the next month, midway through the current month, I try to leave it a little bit later in the piece. Another thing that I know about my motivation levels when it comes to my planning and journaling is that when I have a lot on my plate in terms of tasks, I am so much less likely to actually use my journal. And it's in those periods in particular, if I can predict when they're coming up, that I need to make things so super simple for myself. For me, this would be periods like Vlogmas, when I have a lot of videos coming out on the channel, so a lot of work to do those, and thus don't get into my planner as much, don't use it as much. So there's not a lot of point putting in a whole heap of effort and energy to set up a lot of decorative stuff that I don't end up using. In those times, even if I make my journal really nice to look at and nice to use, if I find it too much effort, I don't get in and use it. So the second strategy is very much about planning ahead for future you, making sure that you're mindful of when your busy periods are and making your journaling as easy as possible for that future version of yourself. But the third strategy is very much about making things flexible. When it comes to my journaling, I love it if when I come to the end of using a spread, the layout looks really full. I like it so that there's effectively no white space. That doesn't necessarily need to be with decoration, it can just be with writing, but I like it to look very used, very filled in. It's for this reason in particular that I like to put more flexibility into my journal, in particular where my daily logs are considered. Rather than pre-sectioning out where I want my daily logs to be and how much space I think that they're going to take up, I like to let them take up as much space as they need. So writing out the header for the first daily, putting in all of the stuff that I need to for that day, and then pretty much regardless of where it finishes, just directly underneath this, putting in the header for the next day. It doesn't necessarily always turn out like that, but having this more flexible approach to the amount of space that my dailies take up means that I'm more likely to get that no white space layout that I'm looking for. The amount of flexibility we can get in our layouts though really depends on both the person and the layout itself. For instance, I know that I don't really want a flexible size in terms of my monthly log. I want to make sure that all of the boxes are the same sizes because I like the way that looks. When it comes to something like a work outputs layout, I'm not usually going to be as flexible with that one because I want to pre-section out how much space I need for each type of content. For something like my actions list though, I just give that one page and I can use it however I want throughout the month. Roughly, I like to make it so that each goal has a designated space, but I'm not too fussed if later in the piece I need to go in and add stuff in seemingly random places. As long as it's captured on that page, I'm not too fussed. By making our planning system flexible though, it can kind of lessen any guilt that we have from not getting in and filling it in. If you're using a pre-printed planner, for instance, any day that you don't get in is recorded by having nothing on that day. If you're using bullet journaling though, in particular daily logs, if you miss a day, it's really not as noticeable, unless you've gone and pre-ruled in where the stuff for that day was supposed to be. I would love to know though, how do you tackle your planning differently when you're feeling lower energy or lower motivation to get in and use your journal? Do you tweak your approach, or do you just kind of try and power through with the same approach you normally have? For me, this is very much a learning process. I'm trying to be better at this lower energy planning and making things more flexible, planning in advance for low energy Jess and making things easy, but sometimes I do fall into that kind of, why can't you just do this? You could do this last week kind of mentality. Not necessarily the best one to be in, but I'd love to hear about your strategies. If you wanted more tips on how to stay consistent with your journal though, then this video is the next one to check out. In that one we talk about a bunch of different techniques that you can use to make keeping up with your journal a little bit easier. So click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.